Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our channel, AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom.
And welcome to another deep dive.
Today we are embarking on I think, a really profound exploration. We're going into Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's authoritative work, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence.
A fantastic source.
It really is. Specifically, we're in Volume 1, Sub-Volume 3, which focuses entirely on the constitutional and legal decisions of Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab. May God be pleased with him.
And this isn't just, a history lesson.
No, not at all. This is basically a masterclass in how you found constitutional governance from the ground up. And actually, before we dive into the substance of today's analysis, we just want to ask, please subscribe to our channel and like this video, please, and also share it with your friends.
It really does help us bring these kinds of detailed discussions to a wider audience.
It does. Okay, so let's frame this. Let's unpack the central question that this whole deep dive is really about. It's a question of survival.
Institutional survival, really.
Right. Why is the longevity and, I guess, the ethical survival of a civilization not fundamentally about the size of its armies or how much money it has, but about the integrity of its courts?
It's such a counterintuitive thought for us today, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
We are just so conditioned to measure power in military and economic terms. But here's Umar, almost 14 centuries ago, and he is prioritizing something completely different.
And that's where the source material just grabs you immediately. I mean, if you look at why great empires fall, it's rarely a single lost battle. It's almost never a sudden economic crash.
It's something from within.
It's an internal failure. It's a long, slow decay of trust. Armies can, defend your borders, revenues can fund your projects, but the one system that's meant to mediate conflict and uphold rights, the judiciary, if that system gets captured by political power, the whole state just becomes unstable. It starts to rot from the core.
And that leads us straight to our mission for today. We are going to dissect a very specific monumental decision made in 14 AH. That's roughly 635 CE.
A pivotal year.
A huge one. This was the moment when Umar formally established an independent judiciary. He created a clear, functional separation between judicial power and executive control. Our job here is to really analyze the deep, timeless constitutional logic behind that reform.
And it really was a constitutional revolution. You're not overstating it. It set a precedent that, frankly, echoes into modern law today.
It absolutely was a revolution, and I think it speaks to this eternal constitutional truth, right? Something that any healthy society needs, no matter its ideology.
Exactly. What Umar did was he created the mechanism to stop justice from just becoming a tool of the state. He established the foundational spine of Islamic constitutional governance. It was a clear boundary. On this side, you have the temporary needs of the government, and on this side, you have the permanent principles of the law. And the two shall not be improperly mixed.
So let's start there with that foundational principle, the core insight that drove this whole thing. Umar diagnosed the danger of executive-controlled courts with, perfect clarity. He said, if the judge fears the ruler, the people will fear the ruler, not the law.
And that quote, it's just pure constitutional wisdom in a single sentence.
It's devastatingly simple.
It is. It perfectly articulates the psychological and, the political process by which the rule of law gets dismantled. Because the moment the judge, who's supposed to be this impartial arbiter, the moment they start operating out of fear, they stop being a servant of the law.
And they become what? An agent of the ruler.
An agent of the ruler, a protective extension of the state. And the immediate consequence is that the court is transformed. It's no longer a place for justice. It's an instrument of state policy.
So the people see this, and they stop trusting the law itself.
Of course they do. They can't trust it. They see the law not as some objective binding force, but just as another expression of the ruler's power, something that can be used against them or ignored completely depending on what's politically convenient.
The law loses all its moral authority.
It becomes just another tool in the executive's toolbox, and at that point, you don't really have a state of law anymore.
Okay, so to really feel the weight of this reform, we need to put ourselves in that historical context. What was the normal way of doing things? What was the judicial model in the big empires around them, like, say, the Byzantines or the Sassanid Persians? What was Umar rejecting?
Well, if you look at the governance models back then, especially in these huge established monarchies, judicial authority was almost always tied directly to the sovereign.
So the emperor is the ultimate judge.
The emperor, the Shah, he was considered the source of all justice and all law. If there was a judge, he was just a delegate. A messenger, really, carrying out the ruler's personal will.
Which is very efficient for the ruler.
Oh, incredibly efficient for the ruler. It centralizes power completely. But it's fundamentally toxic for justice. Judges in that system are just dependent officials. Their authority vanishes the second the ruler gets upset with them.
Which makes the whole system unstable for regular people.
Inherently unstable. It's subject to the ruler's biases, their whims, their political needs of the moment. And Umar saw that. He saw that copying that model of judicial dependence wasn't just, against the spirit of Islamic governance. It was strategically dangerous for the future of the state.
And the source material is really meticulous here. It outlines the specific dangers that you get when the executive controls the courts. Let's take the first two together. Conflict of interest and selective justice. They seem very closely linked.
They're a vicious cycle. They feed each other. Think about conflict of interest first. In any state, the government is often a party in a dispute, right?
Right. It's collecting taxes, it's managing land, it's disciplining its own officials.
Exactly. So if the state is both the defendant or the prosecutor and it controls the judge who's hearing the case, well, the outcome is pretty predictable. There's no real impartial check.
And that's what allows for selective justice.
Immediately. Because the judge's career depends on keeping the state happy, power protects its friends. The powerful officials, the loyalists, they get a pass. And it punishes its critics or just people who are weak and don't have connections.
So justice is handed out based on who you are, not what the facts are.
It's based on loyalty, on social rank, on political usefulness, anything but pure evidence and legal merit. And that just destroys the entire principle of equality before the law. The whole idea of a fixed law becomes meaningless.
I can see how that leads straight to the third danger, which is a catastrophic loss of public trust. I mean, if you're a regular citizen and you keep seeing the powerful walk free while the weak get crushed by the same courts, what happens to your faith in the whole system?
That's the critical sociological bomb that goes off. Once people see the courts as just, political theater where the ending is already written, they stop using them, they disengage.
And what do they do instead?
They turn to other means. The source material warns that this leads society towards a revenge culture.
Wow.
Yeah. When legal options are corrupt or just unavailable, people seek justice outside the law, feuds, vigilante actions, communal violence. The state loses its monopoly on distancing justice, which is arguably the most fundamental job it has. Umar knew that a judiciary that people see as unjust is a direct threat to the social fabric itself.
And the final danger is more internal. It's about the decay of the system itself, institutional corruption. Now, we usually think of corruption as, taking bribes, but this is talking about something deeper.
It's much more subtle and, in a way, much more dangerous. Institutional corruption means the system is broken even if no money changes hands. It means judges start thinking more about their careers, their political standing, their next promotion, than their actual duty to the law, to the Quran and Sunnah.
So they become politicians in robes.
That's a perfect way to put it. They start making decisions designed to please the executive branch, and that compromises the institution from the inside out. It becomes a predictable rubber stamp, not a constitutional check on power.
So this all brings us back to that core insight. Umar was, arguably the most powerful and righteous executive of his time. But he refused to let the security of the state rest on his own personal goodness.
And that's the ultimate lesson of this entire constitutional moment. This idea of a just tyrant or a benevolent dictator is fundamentally flawed.
It doesn't last.
It has no institutional longevity. Umar understood that his own commitment to justice wasn't a guarantee for the future. He would be gone one day. His successors might be less committed, more political, or just less capable.
So the guarantee had to be baked into the system itself.
It had to be institutional.
Yeah.
It needed to be observable, formalized, and structurally independent of the person in charge. And that required creating a clear, formal, independent authority for the judiciary, encoding it right into the DNA of the state to make sure the system would outlive the man.
Okay, so we've established the why, which is incredibly compelling. Now let's get to the what and the when. We're in 14 AH, 635 CE. How was this philosophy turned into actual administrative action?
This is where the theory becomes reality. The crucial step was formalizing the role of the Qat, the judge, as an office that was completely distinct from the provincial governor, the wali, and the rest of the executive branch.
And that's the moment the separation of powers stops being an idea and becomes a functional part of the state.
It's a revolutionary act because it fundamentally changes where the judge's authority comes from. Before this, the governor was often the default judge, or he'd appoint some subordinate to do it.
So the judge worked for the governor.
Exactly. Umar's decree broke that chain of command. It created a direct reporting line for the court in all matters of law that completely bypassed the local executive. The judge was now connected directly to the universal law.
So let's look at the immediate outcomes. The source mentions 3 pillars of this new structure. First, how judges were chosen.
Right. The selection process was transformed. Judges were appointed based strictly on legal competence and integrity. This was not a job for a political ally or a retired general. It was a specialized role for someone who had mastered the Quran, the Sunnah, and legal principles. This move to meritocracy was vital.
And that focus on legal expertise allows for the second outcome, which is the institutional break. You said judges were now explicitly not subordinates of the governors.
That's the core of the separation.
How did that actually work in practice? I mean, you have this huge expanding territory.
In practice, it meant the Khat did not take orders from the wali on how to rule in a case. The governor still had administrative and military control of the province, but the Khat's authority came from the caliph, specifically to administer justice according to the law, not local politics.
So if a governor wanted to pressure a judge,
they couldn't just fire him. They would have to appeal up the chain of command to Medina and risk being rebuked themselves, which was a huge disincentive.
and that leads to the third outcome. Governors lost the power to interfere with or overturn judgments. This is where the rubber really meets the road, isn't it?
This is everything. If a Khat ruled against, say, a high-ranking official, the executive branch, represented by the governor, was obligated to enforce that ruling.
Even if it was against their own interests.
Especially then. It creates this essential constitutional loop. The judiciary says what the law is. The executive uses its power to enforce what the law is. The executive can't exist outside the law, and the court can't function without the executive's enforcement power. By forcing governors to enforce rulings that were inconvenient for them, Umar established the supremacy of the legal process itself.
You can see how this would inject just immense dignity and authority into the role of the court.
Absolutely. The court was elevated not just in status, but institutionally. The role came with its own generous salary, its own security, a legal status that made the judge a co-equal administrator of the state. This wasn't just creating a new department, it was establishing a distinct co-equal branch of governance.
And that institutional integrity, separate from politics, was the first real act of a constitutional state.
It truly was.
Okay, so independence is a great slogan, but unless you can make it work day to day, it's pretty meaningless. And this is where the genius of Umar's reforms, I think, really shines. He didn't just declare separation. He created 4 very concrete, practical rules to make sure judicial independence was a reality.
Right, the source is very clear on this. The success of the whole project depended on building strong institutional walls to protect against the inevitable pressure from the executive. These 4 rules define the practical boundaries of a judge's power.
Let's start with the first one, which is about intellectual freedom, decision-making independence. The law is the only master.
Precisely. This meant that the judge, when looking at a case, had to base their decision only on the revealed texts, the Quran and the Sunnah, and the verifiable evidence presented in court. That's it. They were strictly insulated from political orders, from administrative suggestions, or any other kind of executive pressure.
So no phone calls from the governor's mansion.
Exactly. I mean, think about the big cases, the ones involving powerful tribal leaders or even governors themselves. In a non-independent system, the executive would absolutely call the judge and suggest an outcome for political stability or whatever.
Right.
Decision-making independence meant that kind of interference wasn't just unethical, it was constitutionally forbidden. It was grounds for the interfering official to be rebuked or even dismissed. The law created a purely legal and evidence-based space that the political world couldn't just barge into.
That sounds great, but there must have been friction. What happens when a judge's ruling clashes with executive policy? Let's say a ruling on land rights that contradicts a governor's big infrastructure project.
And that's a test of the whole system, isn't it? When that conflict happened, the executive was required to change its policy to fit the legal ruling or appeal the ruling through the proper judicial channels. They couldn't just ignore the court.
The law constrains policy, not the other way around.
That's the critical point, yes.
Okay, moving to the second rule. Administrative autonomy. This is about logistics.
Yeah.
The courts control their own processes, their schedules, their records. Why is controlling the court calendar so important for independence? Because
control over the machinery of justice is a form of indirect power. If the executive controls your budget, or who you can hire as a clerk, or how quickly a case gets on the docket, they can just suffocate the judicial system. They can pressure a judge or delay an inconvenient case forever just through bureaucracy.
So by giving them administrative autonomy, Umar was preventing what you could call bureaucratic sabotage.
Exactly. And even more important was control over record keeping. Remember, in the 7th century, legal records, the Diwan, were the institutional memory of the state. If the executive controlled those records, they could change them. They could erase inconvenient rulings, manipulate evidence.
So giving control of the records to the core protected the integrity of legal history.
It did. It ensured that judges had a reliable legal foundation to build on for future decisions.
The third rule is maybe the most important for the individual judge. Protection from retaliation. This sounds a lot like modern tenure. How did Umar make sure a Qachi could actually rule against a governor and not, fear for his job or his safety?
This is the operational backbone of the whole thing. If a judge convicts, say, the governor's nephew, that judge has to know that his professional standing, his salary, and his physical safety are secure. If he's worried about being demoted or transferred to some remote outpost or having his pay cut, then the fear comes right back in and impartiality is gone.
So you couldn't be fired for an unpopular ruling.
You could not be arbitrarily removed or punished for an inconvenient judgment. Removal had to be for a clear cause. Proven incompetence, serious ethical misconduct like bribery, or clear negligence. And even then, the removal process was centralized. It required approval from the caliphate after a proper review, not just a snap decision by the local governor.
That protection allowed judges to just focus on the law.
On the law and the evidence, confident that their career was protected by the institution itself.
And finally, the fourth rule, which really validates the whole system. Equality. Before the court. This ensured the court was a binding authority for everyone, from the top to the bottom.
This is the ultimate practical test. If your judge is independent, but he only ever rules against the poor and the weak, the system is a complete farce. The real measure is whether the weakest citizen, a common laborer or someone without tribal connections, could successfully sue the most powerful official.
Even the governor himself.
Even the governor. Or a member of the caliph's own family. And not only did this have to be possible, but the judgment had to be enforced by the executive. That binding nature proves that the separation of powers is real. It proves that the law applies to everyone equally, no matter their rank. If a court decision against the caliph is enforced, then you have proven that law rules over office.
And we need to pivot a bit now to the bigger structural implications. Because Umar wasn't just setting up a legal system, he was trying to manage a massive, rapidly expanding state. He rejected that old model where the governor appoints the judge and the judge obeys the governor, not just because it was unethical, but because it was bad for the unity of the state.
Right, that decentralized model where the local boss controls the local courts was pretty common in other empires. Why was it such a threat to the cohesion of the early caliphate?
Because it creates these little pockets of absolute power. If a provincial governor, the Wadi, controls the local army, the local administration, and the local courts, that governor basically has unchecked total power in his region.
The province becomes a mini-kingdom. It becomes a semi-autonomous mini-kingdom where the governor's personal word is the ultimate law. And this is a huge threat to the central authority. It risks the whole state fragmenting. A governor could use the courts to legitimize suppressing dissent, or seizing resources, or pursuing his own feuds. The central government loses its ability to enforce a single, unified standard of justice.
So this is where that idea of judicial unity versus provincial control comes in. By making the court represent the universal law of the Quran and Sunnah, not the local governor's will, judicial independence actually became a tool of, well, you could call it federal unity.
That's a great way to put it.
The Qad's main loyalty wasn't to the local political boss, it was to the overarching legal system of the caliphate. So the standard of justice in Syria had to be the same as the standard in Egypt or Iraq.
Exactly. The Qacha acted as an institutional check on local executive power. It ensured that while administration could be localized for efficiency, the foundation of justice stayed centralized and consistent. It was really a very sophisticated piece of constitutional foresight, using the rule of law as a binding agent to hold a diverse empire together.
And none of this works, I imagine, without talking about money.
Absolutely not. Integral to all of this is financial independence. We have to talk about the judge's paycheck.
Because financial independence is just another form of control, isn't it? It's just more subtle. How did Umar recognize and, deal with the ways money could compromise a judge?
He saw that a financially dependent judge is vulnerable on so many fronts. There's the obvious one, bribery. It's very tempting if you're struggling to feed your family. But it's also more subtle than that. They become vulnerable to the promise of rewards, or the fear of having their salary delayed, or just the anxiety that ruling against the powerful will bring financial hardship.
If a judge is thinking about his own bank account before the evidence, independence is already gone.
It's gone. So Umar's solution was comprehensive and, for its time, pretty radical. He mandated not just a secure livelihood, but a dignified status and guaranteed generous salaries for judges.
How generous?
We're talking about compensation that was often comparable to, and in some cases, even more than the salaries of the governors they were supposed to be judging.
So they were professionalized and made, effectively, financially untouchable by local politics. Was this centrally funded to keep the governors from having any leverage?
The sources strongly suggest the mechanism was designed to sever that local financial cord. The salary structure was guaranteed by the central treasury in Medina. This minimized the power of a local governor to apply pressure by threatening to cut funds or delay payments.
So the goal was to remove the worry about money entirely.
Two goals, really. First, yes, remove the worry about basic needs so the judge could focus only on the law. And second, to attract the best legal minds to the job. To create a professional class of jurists whose main incentive was upholding the integrity of their office, not pleasing politicians. The whole point was to make sure judges were never forced into dependence.
We've laid out the structure of independence. But as we said earlier, structure is pointless without a fair process. The sources really stress this. Independence without due process is just another form of unchecked power. This brings us to the soul of it all. Procedural justice.
Right.
So what specific procedural rules were put in place to make sure the court process itself was transparent and fair, no matter who was standing in front of the call?
The emphasis on due process was exhaustive because the process is what validates the verdict. Key safeguards included, first, the fair hearing. Both sides, the accuser and the accused, had the absolute right to present their full case, bring evidence, and question witnesses without being cut off or biased against by the judge.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, strict equality in how people were treated. This was essential in a society that was rapidly growing and incorporating all kinds of different tribes and populations. Your family lineage, how much money you had, your social rank, all of it had to be completely irrelevant inside the court. A wealthy member of the Quraysh tribe had to follow the exact same rules as a poor, newly converted Berber.
And what about the evidence itself?
This was the third point, and it was highly sophisticated for the 7th century. The rigorous application of the burden of proof. The responsibility was always on the accuser to prove their claim. This reflects the legal idea that you are presumed innocent.
So you weren't required to prove your own innocence?
No. And the verification of witnesses was also very strict. Their moral character and reliability were scrutinized to ensure testimonies were actually truthful.
The enforcement of these rules really shows that justice was meant to be the outcome of an orderly process, not just some arbitrary decision. It's how you translate the ideal of separation into something a regular person can actually experience.
Precisely. If the judge is technically independent, but he lets the powerful guy intimidate witnesses or submit fake documents without checking them, then the outcome is still tyranny, regardless of the judge's official title. Due process is the operating system that makes independence actually function in a just way.
Now let's pivot to what might be the most revolutionary part of this entire system, and the thing that really sets it apart in global history for its time: executive accountability. The principle that government officials were not above the court.
This is the moment the system really achieves constitutional maturity. The principle was crystal clear. Being an official did not grant you immunity. Officials, governors, tax collectors, military commanders, even the caliph himself could be summoned, tried, corrected, and held liable by a qua, just like any other person.
And this actually happened. It wasn't just a theory.
Oh, it absolutely happened. The historical records are full of instances of governors being successfully sued by ordinary citizens for things like administrative overreach or property damage. There's a famous incident with a governor in Syria who was challenged over misconduct, and Umar had to enforce the court's decision against his own appointed governor.
The constitutional implication of that is just enormous. By making your highest officials answer to an independent judiciary, the state is basically declaring that the law rules over the office.
That is the absolute essence of constitutional government. Accountability isn't optional, and authority does not mean immunity. By creating a judiciary that could and did hold the executive branch accountable, Umar structurally enshrined the rule of law. It meant the government served the law instead of the law being a tool for the government.
We should probably pause here and just think about why this was a constitutional revolution. I mean, this level of institutionalized judicial independence, where judges were separate, well-paid, protected, and could hold power to account, that took centuries to develop in many other legal systems.
It did. You have to contrast this with, say, the political evolution in the West. Concepts like genuine judicial review, security of tenure, the separation of powers. These often required centuries of brutal political struggle. They needed things like the Magna Carta or even full-blown revolutions to be established.
So what made the Islamic system different?
What the source material emphasizes is that this independence was endogenous. It was built from within the faith's own constitutional ethics. Justice, Allah, is seen as a central act of worship. Oppression, Dom, is a major sin. And accountability, Hizbah, is a religious and legal duty placed on the powerful. The separation of powers wasn't a political idea they borrowed. It was a necessary application of their core religious and ethical beliefs.
So that grounding in moral and religious duty is what gave the judiciary the legitimacy and the weight to stand up against the huge power of the executive in this rapidly expanding state.
It was its ultimate source of authority. And if we fast forward, a millennium and a half and compare what Umar decided in 14 AH to the safeguards we see in successful modern legal systems, the parallels are just incredible. They highlight how timeless these constitutional needs are.
What kind of parallels are we talking about?
Well, modern systems protect judges with things like formalized tenure, so they can't be easily fired. They use salary protection, so politicians can't cut a judge's pay as a form of pressure.
And we see the exact same logic in the 7th century system. Independent selection based on merit, financial insulation through high salaries, protection from retaliation, and independent authority.
It's the same fundamental institutional design. It confirms that the basic requirements for justice haven't really changed.
This depth of foresight really shows that the early Islamic state was quickly evolving into a sophisticated, law-centered polity. It was governed by fixed, universal rules, not by the personal whims of a ruler. The state's legitimacy came from its adherence to the law, which is what ensures stability long after any single leader is gone.
But we have to connect this back to you, the listener, in today's world. Because the constitutional problems that Umar was solving are still the defining challenges for countless societies today.
They really haven't gone away.
Not at all. Even nations with very detailed written constitutions often struggle with politicized courts. We see executive pressure through budget cuts or strategic appointments of loyalists. We see selective accountability, where powerful officials seem to be immune from prosecution. And we see fear-based justice, where ordinary people are afraid to bring a case against the state.
So it's clear that just having separate court buildings isn't enough. You need the culture and the political will to respect that separation.
That's the key.
So let's try to summarize the actionable, enduring lessons from Umar's precedent. For any society that's trying to build real, lasting justice, we can distill it down to 4 practical teachings. Lesson 1, the most fundamental. A judge must be protected from executive fear. You have to build institutional walls so high that a judge can rule against the most powerful person in the land and know that their job and their safety are guaranteed.
Lesson 2. Courts must be institutionally respected and empowered. This means giving them the structural, administrative, and financial independence they need to actually function. They have to be seen and treated as a genuinely co-equal branch of government.
Lesson 3, and this is probably the hardest one politically. Officials must face the law equally. The second an official is given immunity from the legal process, the constitutional integrity of the state begins to decay. Accountability has to apply to everyone.
And finally, lesson 4, which is about public trust. Justice must be visible to be believed. This means reinforcing all those procedural safeguards we talked about: due process, transparency, fairness. If the public doesn't see a fair process, they will never trust the outcome, even if the verdict is technically correct.
What really stands out to me in all this is that Hazrat Umar did not fear independent judges. He welcomed them. He saw them as the ultimate safeguard for the legitimacy of his own rule, because he feared injustice and the social collapse it brings far, far more than he feared being challenged in court.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought for you to take away and think about on your own. The strongest ruler is not the one who controls the courts and bends the law to fit their will. The The strongest ruler is the one who sets the courts structurally free, trusts them completely, and then humbly obeys their justice. Ponder this. Islamic constitutionalism becomes real when power bows to evidence. When the state, facing its weakest citizen, accepts the impartial judgment of the law, because that is the defining obligation of governance.
That is a perfect and a very powerful note to end on. And speaking of constitutional documents, our next deep dive is going to focus on probably the most famous judicial document from this whole era, one that actually detailed the processes you talked about today, the letter to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. This document is basically the complete written constitution for judicial procedure.
It's a foundational text, Case 10. We're looking forward to it.
We are. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the foundation of judicial independence. We hope you found this material as insightful as we did.
We really appreciate your time and your dedication to learning. We'll see you next time.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.